Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Emily Cohen at Faith Trust Institute, and happy to welcome you to the webinar today, which is sponsored by Justice and Witness Ministries of the United Church of Christ as part of their 2012 webinar series called Addressing Sexual and Domestic Violence, Tools for Faith Leaders. The focus of the webinar today is on what to do when a woman in your congregation has a temporary protective order. We have three presenters with us today, each of whom has a unique perspective on the issue. I'll be introducing them in just a minute, but first I have a few housekeeping items to go over. You can send me a direct chat message on the right side of your screen if you're having any technical problems, and I can help you sort that out. Our presenters today will try to answer as many questions as we have time for, so please type them in throughout the presentation. You don't need to wait until the end. And you can type them in using either the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll get them either way. And the slides that you'll be seeing today on the screen will be emailed to you later this afternoon so that you can access and refer back to any of the information after we've concluded. And additionally, we are recording this webinar to make it available on our website at a later date. So I think that's all for the housekeeping items. I'll go ahead and introduce our presenters so we can get started. We're joined today by Rabbi Ilana Zaloni, Lieutenant Scott Jenkins, and Judge Tracy Dorsen. Rabbi Ilana Zaloni was ordained at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies at American Jewish University in 2009. She holds a Master's in Education from the Fingret School of AJU and has completed the Rabbinic Management Institute, which is a certificate program in nonprofit management for rabbis. She earned her BA in Geology at Occidental College and was born and raised in San Francisco Bay Area. Faith Trust and Rabbi Ilana met at a breakfast in Atlanta, which was geared towards helping religious leaders access tools for addressing issues of abuse in their community. So we're glad to have you with us today, Ilana. Lieutenant Scott Jenkins has been a police officer for 31 years and was most currently assigned to the Duluth Police Department Uniform Division as a patrol lieutenant. Prior to this assignment, he served as a supervisory sergeant of the Duluth Police Special Investigations Unit and as the commander of the multi-jurisdictional Lake Superior Drug and Gang Task Force. Lieutenant Jenkins has trained on the Duluth model of coordinated community response, on policy development, on the investigative response by police officers, and has assisted in development of domestic violence response curriculum. And most recently, Lieutenant Jenkins has trained throughout the U.S. with the Emerge program out of Boston, regarding lethality assessment and recognizing and documenting risk and danger within intimate relationships. And finally, Judge Tracy Dorsen is with us, and Judge Tracy graduated from the University of Georgia Law School in 1986. She was the Deputy Chief District Attorney of the Gwinnett County in Atlanta until 2000. Judge Dorsen prosecuted thousands of serious felony crimes, including issues and murders involving domestic violence. After taking a few years off to raise her two little girls, Judge Dorfman was hired as a judge in DeKalb County, where she is now a full-time magistrate judge over the criminal division, along with a designation as a Superior Court judge to preside over the temporary protective orders every week. And so we're glad to have you with us as well. So welcome to all of our presenters, and what we're going to do is go ahead and get started with Judge Dorfman, who will, I'm just going to unmute your microphone here. Ilana, actually, did you want to give some background to the webinar first? Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
I wanted to start with a quote from one of my faith traditions texts. It's in the book of Deuteronomy, which is part of our Torah, and it says, "Justice, justice you shall pursue." And as clergy, we sometimes have a very real opportunity to do that by making sure that we help battered people in our communities understand the full protection that's accorded to them by the law, and that we uphold that kind of protection in our congregations. So I'm going to share a case study that happened in my congregation around an issue of a protective order. But before I do that, I know many clergy don't have a legal or law enforcement background. So Judge Dorsen is going to talk about things from a legal perspective. What exactly is the protective order, and what are our responsibilities as clergy if a congregant in our community has one? And then Officer Lieutenant Jenkins is going to talk about what does it look like on the ground, and also offer us some advice about safety. And when they finish giving us some background information, I will share a case study with you that happened in my congregation.
All right. Again, my background, of course, I was a prosecutor, so unfortunately I saw what happens when things go bad in domestic violence situations. I handled, unfortunately, way too many domestic violence cases and sexual abuse cases. And I always taught the police department for years here in the Atlanta area, both in Gwinnett County and DeKalb County. I still teach them all about domestic violence. As a judge, as far as protective orders, yes, I am here in Georgia, and the procedures are probably somewhat different among the states, but once a protective order has been issued by any Superior Court judge in the United States to a particular person, that order is given full faith and credit among our entire country. So in other words, if someone in California got a protective order and then moved to Georgia or moved to Minnesota or moved to New York, and then the other person showed up there, the courts and law enforcement in that state would automatically give full faith and credit, would recognize that protective order, and hopefully, immediately offer that person protection from the violator. And the way it works here in Georgia, and it's similar to how it works in most places in this country, is when a person needs protection, and usually they're told about a protective order when law enforcement responds to a domestic violence call, most of the police officers know enough to at least tell the victim of a potential sexual assault or domestic violence or a stalking case that there are protective orders available. So not only you can proceed with the criminal charges against somebody, but you can also go to the local courthouse, and where you apply for a protective order is not the county where you live, it's the county where the respondent, the person that you're trying to get protection from, the county where they live is where there's actually jurisdiction for the protective order to be issued. So here I'm the judge in DeKalb County over protective orders. The respondent, the person that we are ordering to stay away from someone else, has to be a resident of DeKalb County for me to issue them, usually. Sometimes there'll be cases where they used to live in this county, they've moved out of state, and they're now like recontacting or coming to this county and causing issues that we don't know what county they live in, and we may be able to give a protective order out of state, et cetera. But for the most part, it's going to be it has to be at the courthouse of the county where the respondent lives, the person who is being ordered to stay away. So the person who needs protection is going to go to the courthouse, fill out a petition, swear to the facts of why they need protection. Usually they have to show some kind of pattern for bad behavior, whether there's been prior police activity or not. Usually there has been prior police visits between the parties, but there's usually some kind of history of domestic violence between the parties. They fill out that petition, they meet with a judge, and the judge issues what's called an ex parte protective order. Ex parte means that only one side is present. So it's not a whole lot of evidence that is needed to give for an ex parte, because obviously we want to err on the side of giving this person protection. Therefore, since the other party is not present and is not able to give their side of the story, that ex parte order is very limited. It's only good for 30 days. And once it has been issued, that person is given a date that they have to come back within that 30-day period. Here we do it usually within the first week to 10 days. They have to come back. The other party has to be served with notice that a protective order, an ex parte protective order has been issued against them. So our sheriff's department serves them with the ex parte notice, which says from this moment on you can have zero contact with that person. If they are still living in that residence, they are actually evicted. They're allowed to take some clothing with them, but they are put out of that residence immediately. The keys are taken from them. Any firearms that they possibly have would be taken from them. And then they are also served with a date they can go to court for the 12-month hearing. So obviously at the 12-month hearing, which they'll probably be at sometime within the next 2 or 3 weeks, they can present their side. The hearings that we have, sometimes both parties have attorneys, sometimes they don't. I would say probably 80% of the cases that we hear at the 12-month hearings, they don't have attorneys representing them. So both sides, they put up their side, and I have to find what's called a preponderance of the evidence to issue a 12-month order. It's not like beyond a reasonable doubt, like a criminal case. These are civil superior court orders. So I just have to find that it's more likely than not that what the petitioner is telling me is true, and that there's a reasonable likelihood for future domestic violence or stalking, and then I go ahead and issue a 12-month protective order. So that's basically how the protective orders work. And then at that point, the respondent is, he's given the 12-month protective order. He has to sign up for family violence intervention program, and I explained to him very clearly on the record that means no contact, so that he cannot call, write, text, email, send messages through other people, has to stay 100 yards away at all times. So where the clergy would come into play is if both the petitioner, the person who's after protection, and the respondent, the person who is ordered to stay away, I guess we both members of the same congregation, that may raise some issues for you. As a judge, I will tell you I don't give much leeway on this. Every now and then, I guess if where both parties are a member of a large congregation, we may have one of our super churches or something here in Georgia. We may have where it's very specific that one can be at the 8 a.m. services, one would have to be at the 3 p.m. services, something along those lines. Where never the two shall meet. But for the most part, our protective orders mean no contact whatsoever, so that the respondent would not be allowed to go on the premises of the place of worship where the petitioner does attend. Because unfortunately, I have seen where people will use this as an excuse to violate the order and harm or kill the petitioner. Is there anything else? I'm not sure. That's basically what a protective order is. And then during the 12-month protective order, if need arises, the petitioner can actually then file a new motion and try to get a permanent order, which would be good for another 3 years or even lifetime if needed. Does anyone have any questions about that?
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in either the chat box or the Q&A box.
I was asked also to kind of address the responsibility of the clergy. Obviously, legally, you're not under any legal obligation to be policing, enforcing these orders. That's up to, law enforcement or whatever. But obviously, I guess for me, on a kind of a moral basis, you would need to be, hopefully, that the petitioner would feel like this is a safe haven for them to be, and that when they do have that protective order, whether it's their workplace, their place of worship, where they live, where they go, that everyone respects that order, obeys the order, and does not allow any leeway for the respondent to have any kind of access to them. So I guess I would kind of err on the side of, kind of an all or nothing, pretty much, that they would not be allowed to be there.
Well, if there aren't any questions, perhaps we can move on to the next segment.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks so much, Tracy, for offering
you.
that perspective. And Scott, if you would like to tell us a little bit more about your experience with TPOs and what they look like on the ground, and any safety recommendations that you might have for clergy.
Thanks, Emily. Welcome, everybody. First off, I just want to apologize. I didn't get my PowerPoint stuff in quick enough, but Emily assured me that she'll get this stuff out to anybody that wants it on my part of the presentation. I just wanted to start with kind of framing, I think, what everybody's thinking about protective orders and what's the dangerousness, how much credence should we give them, how do we deal with them, what should we expect. This was a quote by the National Center for Victims of Crime. It said, last winter, police found the bodies of a man and his girlfriend. The man had tracked his girlfriend to her cousin's house, broken down the door, shot her as she called 911, and then turned the gun on himself. Next to the woman's body, the police found a court order directing the murderer to have no contact with the victim. The killer had violated that order 4 times before murdering his victim. Now, if that's not a direct indictment of our ability as a society to be able to protect women from their abusers, I don't know what is. And I think that's a really good springboard for us to talk a little bit about what the realities of protection orders are. Protection orders are a legal order. They're a legal instrument designed to protect women and their children from abuse. There's much more to it, as the judge was saying, in regards to the legal mechanics of applying for an order, of providing information as the basis for an order so that a judge can make a reasonable and intelligent decision about whether the order should be granted, on what basis, for how long, and what part or what items of relief should be granted both on a temporary basis and on a permanent basis. But I think some of the realities are is that if we really look at statistics, and forgive me, I'm going to be referring to my notes from time to time here, the statistics really bear out and demonstrate to us that the most dangerous time for a woman and her children in an abusive relationship are around that leaving experience, around the time that either immediately before, during, or immediately after they choose to leave a relationship. And it's generally not that they're leaving because they no longer love the abuser. It's not that they're leaving because they can't afford to stay there. It's leaving because the violence has become more frequent and more excessive. And at that point in time, we know from looking at fatality reviews in intimate partner homicides that there was generally, in many of these cases, some element of either a protection order or violation of protection orders or stalking that was going on just prior to the homicide. So we know that it's not that there's a direct link between getting a protection order, whether a temporary or permanent protection order, and then being predicted that a homicide is going to happen. But we know that it's an indicator or one of those factors that says, hey, look, when things get so dangerous for a woman that she has to get a protection order, we know that the stakes are very much higher at that point. And all of us in the system and on the outside of the criminal justice system should be much more on our toes and much more attuned to helping to provide safety everywhere, whether it's in church, whether it's in public, whether it's at her employers or it's in her own home, for this woman against the potential violence that she faces from her abuser. So survivor experiences really indicate generally that when they attempt to leave, it's generally 7 to 12 times before a woman's successful. And that's not because she's just necessarily unable to leave the relationship. Much of it is because she's testing different mechanics of leaving. It might be about safety. It might be she's not aware of or not certain of how he's going to react to having an order or when he discovers that she's left, and in many cases when she's left with the children and he doesn't have access to her anymore and he doesn't know where she's gone to. Some of it's economic considerations. Is she going to be able to support herself and her children when she leaves the relationship? Is she going to be able to make it on her own? Is she going to have the type of money and support to be able to keep herself hidden or to move far enough away from her batterer that she's going to be safe in the long run? Some of it's about resource availability. If she's someplace where she's very isolated, perhaps in a mountainous area of the United States or someplace that's quite remote from the nearest resources, it may be very difficult for her to leave, knowing that she doesn't have any place to really turn for education, for transportation, reliable transportation, for living arrangements, places to live, places to take care of her children, whether it's daycare or whatever. So the more isolated they become, the more difficult it is for them to find resources. I know that in the city of San Diego several years ago, they before they came up with their family justice center, which became a one-stop shopping spot for women trying to draw upon and locate resources available for them when they leave abusive relationships or while they're still in the abusive relationship. And they found that women had to go, once they identified the resources that they needed, whether in totality or a la carte, They had to go to so many different places that were so geographically spread throughout the city of San Diego that there was a really determined need to get all of those resources into one spot. And so they found that the more difficult it was for women to find those resources closely located together or to easily access them, the less propensity for them to try to reach out to those resources. So that goes directly to the leaving experience, and many women choose to stay in a relationship just because those resources aren't available. One of the other considerations is children when it comes to that leaving experience is, how old are your children? Do some of the children have very close ties to the batterer? Is it going to be difficult to move those children? How many children she has? Are there children with special needs in the family? Some of those things keep her very tied to the abuser and keep her tied to the current location that she's at. It makes it much more difficult for her to leave. And then finally, it's just her opportunity. Is she tests several times when it is that she's going to have the time to most likely leave the relationship where she's going to be successful at getting away without or with the least amount of danger or risk to herself immediately while she's leaving. So all of those things lend credence to that 7 to 12 times that she's trying to leave the relationship. Now, for you as clergy and as members of the church and as lay pastors, when you are looking at your congregation, that woman may be someone you know. You may understand that she's been in or is in an abusive relationship. It may be someone who appeared recently in your congregation that you don't know, that approaches you where you find out that it's an abusive relationship, maybe somewhere else in your state, maybe from a totally different jurisdiction or state somewhere else across the country. And the question begs is, what risk is there to her? What risk is there to your congregants? What risk is there to the folks that work with you in your church or synagogue? And how do you hook that person up with resources? What are their needs? How do you protect confidentiality? There's a lot of different questions that come to mind for any of us who deal with battered women, and especially women trying to leave a relationship when things become more dangerous. Just keep in mind that one of the largest dynamics to protective order time and that leaving experience is particularly the idea that this abuser, who generally, especially by the time that a woman is looking at leaving a relationship or getting a protection order or both, generally the frequency and the severity of violence has become much more significant over a period of time, maybe a short period of time, maybe a long period of time. And as she decides to leave that relationship, that batterer loses access to her and her children. And so they become sometimes quite persistent in looking for her, and once they find her persistent in making contact, they become much more sophisticated in many cases on how they provide or how they make contact with her, maybe through a third party, maybe by leaving notes. And also they become much more provocative in the way that they start to taunt the criminal justice system with walking through the order or violating the order, sometimes in a subtle way and sometimes in a very dramatic way. And that's when we see much of the public violation of these protection orders, where he just really doesn't care who sees it anymore. He doesn't care who tries to intervene or get involved. And that's when we start to see bad events like shootings or some type of collateral assault on someone who tries to intervene. So just know that the stakes become very high at about that time. Excuse me. I wanted to address some of the things about protective orders that people may not necessarily see from their vantage point, but as a police officer for 31 years, both as an enforcer of protection orders and also as a supervisor, having my officers out enforcing protection orders, is that there are some difficulties, there are some realities to protection orders that make them difficult to enforce and make them at least difficult to make a decision about how you're going to enforce them that people don't generally know. Some of those points are this, is the orders are frequently vague, they might be unclear, and they don't specifically always identify where the points of contacts can be what the relief is going to be for the petitioner in this particular case, how far away a respondent has to stay, or even if the respondent's been served at that time. I know I and Judge Dorsen had talked just prior to this about the idea or the differentiation between a temporary protection order and a permanent protection order. And that temporary protection order, or the ex parte that's initially entered as an emergency order when that battered woman first shows up and provides the affidavit of abuse with the outline of abuse, that there's a particular amount of time in Judge Dorfman's case, in her state 30 days, in Minnesota 14 days before a hearing is set where that respondent has to be served and has an opportunity to show up in court to argue as to whether there should be a permanent protection order in place. So during that time, that might be a very dangerous time. It might be a time that he's trying to manipulate or dissuade her from going forward with the order. And those might be the times that you see that interaction in your particular church or synagogue. Mutual orders. Sometimes there's mutual orders that are issued, especially in levels of, or in cases of low-level violence, or where both parties have used some type of violence. Oftentimes we see them in Minnesota or in some other states where she started to defend herself or attempted to defend herself. And are you able to still hear me, Emily? Emily?
Sorry about that. We just had, I'm not sure if it was my computer, but we just had a little bit of a glitch, and so I lost you there for a second.
Okay. I didn't want to continue if it was. Hopefully we're back on. So
yes,
sometimes
I can hear
mutual orders that the mutual orders are issued, especially surrounding the times when she might start to defend herself or fight back, and especially around that time, I think coincides with the leaving experience. So those mutual orders can be really, really difficult for folks. Imagine this, where you have two parishioners, a man and wife, or boyfriend, girlfriend, who you know are in an abusive relationship, and they both show up at your service, and they both have orders excluding contact or being within so many feet or yards of each other. And now you have one saying, hey, look, I was here first. The other one has to leave. The other says, no, it's a public place. I can be here if I want. Just says I can't institute any harm against the other person and stuff. Is how are you going to handle that? You know, how are you going to make one person leave or ask one person to leave over the other person? And again, it comes down to protection. It's again the spirit of who's really meant to be protected by these protective orders. There's some things that are very difficult with these orders in regards to custody and visitation. As you can imagine, anytime that one parent is restrained from having full contact or visitation with a child, emotions run high. And again, those public meeting places, church, schools, extracurricular events, those become the forum, unfortunately, for the abuse and the contact to continue, even though there's an order that might restrict those things. So again, the propensity for that to happen at church or synagogue is very, very high, especially because the children and the mother, the children and the petitioner are going to both be present at the same time. Validation of orders by police can be really, really difficult. Sometimes it's a woman calls us for help, a police officer responds, she tells us that there's an order in effect, he's not supposed to be at the house or not supposed to be anywhere close to her, and she doesn't have a copy of the order with her, and if she, especially if she's not from our state or from our jurisdiction, as the judge said, we have to give full faith and credit based just on the validity or what appears to be a valid protection order from another jurisdiction or from tribal lands, that's full faith and credit. There is still a responsibility by the police agency, the enforcing agency in the state where she's now at, to try to contact her jurisdiction and make sure that there is a valid order in effect and that it's been signed by a judge and that it's still within the effective dates before we enforce it. And as you can imagine, a lot of times these happen late at night on a weekend or a holiday, and sometimes if the jurisdiction that was ordered in, whether it's tribal, Indian territory, or it's some remote jurisdiction, it might be difficult to pull those records at that time or on those days of the week. Validation of orders by police can be really difficult at times. The order may cause a false sense of security. That's one of the things I know my personal experience has been, is that it seems that police, many people in the system, the second that she's really seen escalation in both the frequency and the severity of violence, the first thing we do is say, hey, you need to get an order, and this order will protect you. The problem is the order's paper, and the order is only as good as the people enforcing it. And if we don't have consistency in enforcement of the orders across the nation, from state to state, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, the order really doesn't do her any good. If the police don't take it seriously, if the public doesn't take it seriously, if the clergy doesn't take the order seriously, if someone says to them, either the petitioner or the respondent, hey, I don't think he's really that dangerous, I don't think that he would try to kill me or that he would dangerously assault me, I just want to get away from the threats of abuse and stuff. If we don't give it due seriousness, or if she talks us into not giving it due seriousness, the potential for some type of harm is quite high. And then finally, orders may vary in content from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There may be a very subtle variance, but in some places, depending on the court that's reviewing it, depending on the judge that reviews it, and depending on state law, they may not, the orders for relief may not look the same, the stay-away orders may not look the same, the amount of distance that someone has to keep may not look the same, and stuff. So those things all make it difficult for us to enforce these. So I just wanted to give something. How are we doing on time, Emily?
Good, yeah, thank you. That was really helpful. You can, if you have more comments, you can go ahead and finish, and then we'll move along to Alana.
I just wanted to read a short statement for people to think about, and this hopefully will be in the handouts later, is just a hypothetical. It's not really hypothetical. It's one that happens, I think, fairly frequently, and I just changed the venue a little bit. But something to think about, and a couple questions for you to ponder. Is a woman who you've seen only a few times at your worship service over the past few weeks approach you today to tell you that she's been in an abusive relationship for several years. She tells you she and her children recently moved to your city from another state to flee the abuse, and she believes her abuser doesn't know where she is, but that he'll try to find her. She indicates she has a protection order from her home state and her abuser is dangerous. So the question is really this, if you think about it, and these are questions that you should think about and try to come up with an answer with to help you prepare for the eventuality, if it hasn't happened already in your congregation, is how do you determine the future risk posed to this woman, your staff, and your congregants? How is it that you're going to get information to determine what risk it is, considering whether he finds her, if he shows up, if he confronts her with violence at your place of worship. And then secondly is how are you going to protect this woman's confidentiality? If she's in need of services, if she tells you that she wants your help in locating services, how are you going to do that and still keep her confidential where this person who's her abuser won't be able to track her and find her? And then finally, how do you provide a safe environment for her and her children to continue to seek spiritual guidance in your place of worship? Those are questions that it's very helpful to think about in the forefront and try to find answers for. And then finally, some of the safety recommendations that I could make are simply this, is take all protective orders seriously. Regarding intimate partner homicide, Jacqueline Campbell, when she did a study back in 2003 of intimate partner homicide, she came up with this, is that about half of victims killed or nearly killed didn't recognize that their partner was capable of killing them. In many cases, they downplay the dangerousness and the potential for lethality or dangerous assault. So that's one thing if they do, but in each and every one of these cases where you know that there's a protective order or she's starting to seek a protective order, take these cases very seriously. And just the fact that you're signed in here and that this webinar is going on shows me that people do and that they're taking taking this very seriously and pondering what their role is in continuing to provide a margin of safety not only for her but for your congregations. Know what questions to ask the petitioner of an order. Do you have an order? Are you comfortable giving us a copy of the order so that we can see how best to protect you? Keeping that order confidential, just within the people that need to know about it. Determine what the respondent looks like so that you'll be able to recognize him if he shows up at your place of worship. And those people that most need to be able to recognize him, whether it's a rabbi or it's a pastor or clergy, whether it's a lay minister, whoever is going to potentially be at a point where they can observe this person in your congregation, your place of worship, or your synagogue. You need to be able to recognize this person. So get a photograph, get a description, whatever you can. Don't allow the respondent on the premises if he doesn't have a legitimate reason for being there. Make sure that you're either trespassing them or if there's an order in effect that you're calling the police or at least warning them that you're going to call the police if he's there violating the order. Document any extraordinary incidents, arguments, threats, physical contact, irrational behavior, injuries on either the petitioner, the children, or the respondents. And then ask the petitioner to provide you with a copy of the protection order if they're willing to give that to you. No one involved your local domestic violence advocates, your local police. Make sure that I think had seen some information earlier that Alana was going to recommend that you get to know who your police responders are, that do a particularly good job and are good liaisons with the police community with domestic violence response. And then report any incidences of violence or threatening behavior by the respondent and have a safe exit strategy from the building for the petitioner in case he shows up and you need to be able to remove her and her children without him knowing that they're leaving the building.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much, Officer Scott. I think that's really helpful in sort of clarifying the parameters, what this looks like, helping us to understand all of the complexities and complications of the situations, and giving us all those helpful questions to consider. I think that is a good segue into Rabbi Alana sharing with us her case study of her experiences at her congregation dealing with the situation of a temporary protective order. So I'll go ahead and pass it off to Rabbi Zaloni.
And right before the rabbi starts on her case study, I just wanted to say, as a judge, it's unbelievable as a judge here in Atlanta, Georgia, to hear Officer Jenkins speak, Lieutenant Jenkins speak. It's like we work together on a daily basis. So Lieutenant Jenkins, I mean, I see exactly the same thing. Every single thing that you just said is exactly the same way. It all goes down to, I guess, no matter what part of the country you're in, right? And I also wanted to repeat, as far as same thing, I train all the police officers. Don't give up on these people because it may be the 6th, 7th, 8th time that they get frustrated, they go to the same house or whatever, and then the person dismisses the criminal case or dismisses the protective order. And so a lot of people outside that situation will judge them, saying, oh, well, obviously they're just playing games or whatever, they don't really want it. And that's not the case. I always tell them, don't ever judge anyone because you're not in their shoes. You have no idea when is the right time for them to finally exit that situation. So, Lieutenant Jim, I swear to God, I feel like we've been working together for years because that's exactly everything that he just stated is exactly the same way, I deal with on a daily basis here in Georgia. And now over to Rabbi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lieutenant Jenkins, and also Judge Dorsen. So here's what happened in my congregation. There was a family, a husband and a wife. They had 3 children in their household. The 2 oldest children were not biologically the father's. He was their stepfather, but the youngest child was his blood. And things had escalated in their family, and one night he attacked his stepson. And so a temporary protective order was put in place. And the wife came to me and let me know what was happening. And I was able to help her find the resources in our community, lawyers, social workers, psychologists, to help her start on a separation from her husband. But in the meantime, the Jewish high holidays were coming up, and this is a very important time of the year for the Jewish people. we start with our New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and 10 days later, a holiday called Yom Kippur. And the whole point of Yom Kippur is to think about the things you've done wrong over the course of the year and seek forgiveness from people you've hurt as well as from God. And the abuser was very upset about the protective order being in place because it meant he couldn't come to the synagogue. And one of the dilemmas about being clergy is that they were both my congregants. What the research is showing in domestic abuse is we need to start intervening with the men as well. We've come so far with, first of all, criminalizing beating your wife and children, right? That was a good step. And creating resources for women and children. And our next step is to go to the source of the violence and help them find a way out of it, because no one grows up to be an abuser because they had a happy and healthy childhood. And my dilemma as clergy, no matter how angry I was at him for attacking his stepson, was that if I cut off my relationship with him, I'm not going to be able to continue to encourage him to seek out an organization like Men's Stopping Violence. And what's more, we're coming up on a time of year, and in the Jewish faith, we truly believe that everyone is capable of repentance and can change their ways. How do I reject him at this time of year? How do I say, well, I know you truly need to do repentance, but you can't be here? However, right, if you have someone attacking their stepson, that child's safety definitely takes priority. So what I ended up doing was reaching out to a colleague who I knew could share the confidence and say, this person, this abuser, needs a place to go for high holidays. The trouble with high holidays is you actually have to pay for a ticket to attend services. And so I asked that congregation would they comp him the tickets so that he could have his repenting experience that year. But then I had a whole other dilemma, which is, well, what if he shows up at our congregation? We do have security on the high holidays, so I was able to alert those officers, this is what it looks like, this is his name. We also have one entry point into our synagogue on the high holidays, and I had a dilemma there too, which is the staff is sitting at that entry point and checking people in. And I felt torn between violating the family's privacy, but also letting staff know if this guy shows up, he can't come in the building. It's not okay, and you should send him to this other synagogue where he has tickets waiting for him. In the end, what I did is I told our most senior employee who would be sitting at the table, and told her to not get too far from that table. And in the end, everything was very peaceful. The wife and children attended services with us. I don't know if he took me up on going to the other synagogue or not. I continued to have a relationship with the wife, but she eventually left the synagogue because once the protective order ran out, she was not able to obtain a permanent order, and her abuser started showing up at the synagogue, and she said, you know what, it's just not worth it. I'm going to start over in a different congregation. And here's another challenge you might run into. Not all of the clergy at my synagogue were on the same page about the abuser. And so there were mixed messages for the abuser. Some of us, like me, were asking him to take responsibility for his actions and consider going to groups like Men Stop Violence, but other clergy were being sympathetic when he would say, my wife is just crazy. And it is hard. There were times when he was talking to me, and he's this very put-together, well-heeled, suave guy. And his wife, who's been enduring his abuse for a decade, she's a little bit edgy and scared and hard to talk to. So it's very easy for an abuser to convince the community or convince staff and clergy that the person receiving abuse is not. And in the end, I persisted with saying, I think you need help. This is a great organization. I will be supportive of you. He stopped coming around the synagogue too. I want to close with offering you a list of resources that will be good to have at your fingertips in handling these situations. And I ended up meeting all of them. So first of all,
sorry, this is just so you know, we did start about 5 or 10 minutes after the hour. And so we can go 5 or 10 minutes after the hour if you can stay for that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. There are hotlines available, and I wanted to make sure that the wife and children had these numbers readily available to them as issues came up. But I encouraged them to make sure they didn't leave, they didn't put it into their cell phone in a way that would indicate to the abuser what this phone number was, because they didn't want it to be another reason for violence. Next slide. Shelters. In this case, the violence hadn't escalated to a point where she really needed a safe place to stay for the night, but it did help me be aware that I needed to know how to do that. And one of the things I found out in Atlanta was that a lot of the shelters, not all of the shelters take children, and a lot of them actually don't take walk-ins. There's a central replacing agency in Atlanta, and they screen all of the people who are seeking shelter to find the best match. You know, for example, if someone has a drug abuse problem, and by the way, it's not uncommon for women who are experiencing abuse to have a drug abuse problem, because who wouldn't want to check out of that scenario? They need to be in a certain kind of shelter versus. So it's important that you know what the shelters are in your area, where you can refer people to, and how the system works. Next slide. Psychologists and therapists, that kind of mental care, mental health, can be really expensive. So if you have therapists in your congregation that would be willing to work pro bono or can hook you into the city system of psychologists that are good that work pro bono, that's an important resource to have. And you want to be a little careful here, because just as sometimes you have clergy who say, you can all work this out, it'll just take marriage therapy. You want to make sure you know the psychologist you're working with is going to take the situation seriously. Yes, the FAFSA Center that Judge Dorsen is mentioning, the Women's Resource Center here in Atlanta. We'll get to that too. Next slide. Social workers. So not only do most survivors of abuse have therapeutic needs, but they have practical needs. If I move out of the house with my kids, where am I going to live? How am I going to buy groceries? How am I going to re-register my kids for school? All of those day-to-day life issues, that's something a social worker is trained to help with. So know the social workers within your congregation and know the social work resources in your community. Next slide. Lawyers. So if a woman is going to leave a relationship, and by the way, I shouldn't always say woman, if a man or a woman, particularly if you know that you have a same-sex couple, it's not unusual for homosexual men to be abused and have lots of issues of privacy and sometimes shame in seeking help. It can be an even more complicated case of trying to get someone the help they need. But if a lawyer who practices family law, that's a great thing to have at your fingertips as well, because they may be able to offer free legal counsel if not take a pro bono case. You know, legal aid these days is, I don't know how, they must have the wisdom of Solomon to decide which cases to take and not take. In these economic times, they can't always take people who have really legitimate cases and no money. So if as clergy, you have contact with lawyers who are willing to help, that can be a big asset in helping someone get out of an abusive relationship. Next slide. Law enforcement agents. Lieutenant Jenkins was mentioning as well, it's so important to know who to call. In the case of this family I was working with, the husband was moving out, and the wife was really scared on that day that her husband might try something. And so she felt torn between being in the home and making sure that it wasn't trash and taking care of her own safety. And so I called one of my contacts, a psychologist who runs a group called Men Stopping Violence, and I said, what can I do to help her? And he said, Well, there's a police officer on the Bolton force who specializes in domestic abuse cases. Why don't you give him a call, and perhaps he can provide an officer to be present on moving out day to make sure that everyone's safe. Next slide. Local agencies. So Judge Dorsen mentioned we have the Women's Resource Center here in Atlanta. It's kind of a one-stop shop. Do you wanna describe it a bit?
The Women's Resource Center, especially what I still here with DeKalb County, which is DeKalb and Fulton are two of the bigger counties here in Atlanta. It's an amazing. Thank goodness that the resources are finally developed to help people, and they have more resources than I even know what they have. So we have liaisons set up between the Women's Resource Center and the court system. And they make sure that whenever we have victims, whether they come to see me for warrants or whether they come for protective orders, we refer them immediately, get all the information to send them to the Women's Resource Center. They'll actually come to the courthouse, and they actually are across the hall from us right now. But anyway, they tell them all the resources on how to help with, taking care of utilities, places to live, schools, all the different questions that the victims of domestic violence would have questions about. So the Women's Resource Center is probably, it's such a blessing for all of us to have. And like the rabbi pointed out, like Lieutenant James pointed out, it's amazing how far we've finally come in dealing with these cases that, the general population is starting to realize that, these crimes are taking place, and that's why I try to train the police officers, the new recruits, as just as they're coming out of the academy, on how to approach domestic violence cases and everything, because it's not, we're trying to get away from the old days where it was basically, they would answer the call and tell the wife or the girlfriend or whatever, look, this is your problem, you call us out here again, we're going to arrest both or whatever. And so people used to be afraid to even involve law enforcement. So we've come a long way, and of course we still always have a long way to go. But it's great to see that there are more and more agencies and resources and everything developing every year to help in this situation, because it's a nationwide epidemic. Obviously, I think as economic times are hard.
CDC is actually involved in.
Yeah, the center is in control. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's an epidemic, and so we've got to do something to start eliminating domestic violence in this country.
Is that the last slide, Emily?
It is, yes.
Then I'd like to close with a blessing of Shalom. In Hebrew, we often translate that in English as peace, but what it actually means is completeness. And you just saw a list of several resources that I needed to do to get a complete healing for the survivor of this abuse. So I want to leave you with words of hope, which is, it can be really overwhelming when someone walks into your office and says, I'm being abused. But in the end, right, you are just a piece of this completeness for the woman. And if you reach out to other professionals, you can provide her with the blessing of peace.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Ilana Zolani, for that. I just have a couple words to close us out, and I just want to say thank you so much to Judge Tracy Dorsen for being with us, and Lieutenant Scott Jenkins and Rabbi Zolani once again. I think it was really valuable to have the three of you on at the same time and to be able to get various perspectives and expertise on such a large issue and an important issue. So thank you to each of you. We hope that this has been a helpful resource to those online with us today, as well as those who may be listening to the recording. I can point you in the direction of our website, which is faithtrustinstitute.org, for more information on various webinars and also to access the recording of this webinar soon. I want to remind you that I'll be sending you these slides of the presentation later this afternoon, so you can refer back to the information. And I'll also be adding some additional resources from Lieutenant Jenkins and other resources that came up during the presentation today. So you can be looking out for that. When you close your window today, there will be a survey that will pop up, so just take a few minutes to fill that out to let us know how your experience was and any ideas you have for us for future webinars. Thank you again to Justice and Witness Ministries of the United Church of Christ for sponsoring the webinar today. Their website is up on the screen there, and you can read more about their series online. Thanks again to all of our presenters, and this concludes the presentation today. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.